Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been, I think, talking around the primary problem here, which is a lack of supply. I may be the only person at this dais who remembers the Arab oil embargo of early 1970s, and the price went up because the supply went down. You weren't, you were a little kid, Barrasso, don't give me that. The price went up because the supply went down. The price went down because we had more supply than demand during the pandemic. And production went down because of the collapse in demand. The demand came back, but the supply didn't come back. Why didn't the supply come back? Because the oil industry made a conscious decision to invest in their shareholders rather than their production capability. This past year, they've announced almost $40 billion of stock buybacks, which does nothing for production or anybody else except shareholders and perhaps the executives, and about $50 billion of dividends. That's money that could have gone into investment for production. And that's the reality. That's what's driving this. It isn't lease pauses on federal land, and it isn't the Keystone Pipeline. My mother used to say, you're straining at gnats and swallowing camels. The lease pause is a gnat. The Keystone Pipeline, which was mostly for export, is a gnat. The camel is the failure of the industry to respond to the increase in demand since the decline of the pandemic. One of an executive in the industry put it, I think, absolutely perfectly when he said just a few weeks ago, you've made a promise to be more disciplined, a promise to his shareholders, getting cash back to shareholders with these dividends. The question is, are you going to keep your promise, or are you going to be patriotic? Well, we all know what they chose, not to be patriotic. And the production isn't there. And I understand some reluctance because of the hammering that they took during the pandemic. But that's really the fundamental problem here. And what's hampering the growth of production isn't federal policy, and it isn't scary statements from the White House about climate change. It's a failure to invest in the production capability. And that's really what's driving this. Mr. Eklund, you made this point that it was the COVID recovery that has driven the increase in demand. Supply hasn't kept pace, and therefore prices are up. And now the war in Ukraine has further strained supply, or at least has affected the international market. Again, prices have gone up almost 50 cents or $1 just since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. This is all about supply and demand. And in response, I just parenthetically want to say the estimate by the World Bank for climate migrants by 2050 is 200 million people. That is a national security disaster. So if anybody questions what I'm saying, just Google oil buybacks, and you'll read about the stock buybacks and the dividends that are being paid rather than investment in production. Mr. Eklund, am I on the right track here?
Senator, the interaction between investors and the oil and gas industry is a pretty nuanced one, and I would stress that it's not a really elective kind of an interaction. The oil and gas companies cannot thumb their nose at the concern of investors, or investors will walk away from them. So I think that.
But there's a difference between, they make the highest profits in 8 years last year. So it's not a question of thumbing your nose, it's a question of proportionality. And there certainly could have been greater investment in increased production rather than, I mean, that's really what we're talking about here.
Well, and I think that my expectation is that you will see a change in the production levels that in part reflects the really acute sense that this time is different. So, you know, these discussions that are taking place this week, for example, at a major conference in Houston, I think you're going to see a response. The last point that I would make is that for big companies like one represented at this witness table, revenues off their hydrocarbon activities also support in a critical way what they are trying to do in the decarbonized space.
I don't question that. I think that's a great output. My problem is the diversion of the record profits or the highest profits in 8 years to non-production or non-fossil fuel alternatives. One other just minor point, not a minor point, but a separate point. Everybody's talking about LNG. We're talking about LNG as we're exporting, we're helping our Europeans. I just want to note, increased LNG exports beyond some certain point, which is we're about 15% of production now, is going to indubitably affect domestic prices. Again, supply and demand. If we diminish the supply available in the United States by exporting 15, 20, 30%, which is in the pipeline, which is in the construction pipeline, domestic prices for natural gas are going to surge. That happened in Australia. It's going to happen here. And it just seems to me we need to be clear-eyed about this and understand it. It bothers me that everybody's on the LNG bandwagon without taking cognizance of the effect on domestic gas prices, which affects manufacturers and, Lord knows, consumers all over the country. Thank you.